Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargava, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In this episode, we talk about the latest climate change report by the IPCC. We also take a quick look at the action that BharatPe has taken against Ashneer Grover, the company's managing director and co-founder. But first, we talk about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russian forces have continued to move closer and closer towards the Ukrainian capital. At the time of this recording, the Russian military had taken control of the southern city of Kherson. According to Ukraine's emergency service, the Russian invasion had killed more than 2,000 Ukrainian civilians and destroyed hundreds of structures, including transport facilities, hospitals, kindergartens, and homes. Meanwhile, for those here in India, the main concern is that many students are still stuck without any supplies or support. The Indian government has said that out of the approximately 20,000 Indians in Ukraine, around 6,000 have managed to come back home, and another 6,000 odd people have crossed over to other countries, meaning that around 8,000 Indians are still in Ukraine. On Tuesday, one Indian student named Naveen Gyanagowda, hailing from a village in Karnataka, was killed in the eastern city of Kharkiv. This was the first Indian casualty of the war. In this segment, Indian Express's associate editor Shubhajit Roy joins us to talk about the government's plan to evacuate the remaining Indians from the country. But first, he talks about Gyanagowda's death.
Yeah, that was an unfortunate death that took place of an Indian student in Kharkiv, which is near the eastern border of Ukraine, sharing with Russia. And fighting has been on and been raging with shelling happening from the Russian military, and the Ukrainian military forces have also been fighting them. So the information that one has is that this Indian student had gone to a grocery store to get some food, because most of these kids have been in the bomb shelters or in bunkers, which are essentially underground metro stations or basements of different buildings. So obviously he had gone to get some food and some essentials. And that is where the shelling happened, and he unfortunately was at the wrong place at the wrong time.
He says that in war terminology, this is what is called collateral damage, which in this case tragically ended the life of a 21-year-old.
The family obviously has been distraught, and the government has reached out after his death. The Prime Minister Narendra Modi called up the family and to express his condolences. And as we speak, the Indian side is in touch with the Ukrainian as well as the Russian authorities for a safe passage of his body, that the mortal remains can be brought back to India.
After the first Indian casualty, families are even more worried about the 8,000 Indians who are still stuck there. In a recent episode, we had spoken to some of these people, and they had been scared and frustrated that no officials were in touch with them, and they were having to rely on advisories issued by the Indian embassy, which at times had not worked out for them. Shubhajit says that the challenge right now is that the situation is very fluid, and plus the Indian embassy in Ukraine is not a very big one.
It's a smaller embassy by Indian embassy standards. Globally, if you see, it has not more than 6 or 7 diplomats and some other officials and staff. So it's a small to mid-size embassy, which is now caught with the challenge of evacuating about an estimated 20,000 students. To help with the evacuation, the Indian government sent some Russian speakers to the Indian embassy to help out as a reinforcement. So the Indian officials have been able to so far facilitate return of 12,000 Indians, mostly students, out of the 20,000. That is 60% of the Indian nationals have been evacuated, have left the country. Some on their own, some with embassy's help. and remaining 8,000 are still there, out of which 4,000 are actually either in the western border adjoining Poland, Slovak Republic, Hungary, and Romania. So they are out of harm's way. But there are still about 4,000 Indian nationals who are still there in the conflict zone, which is in the eastern side.
This is the side that Russia has been attacking from. This eastern side is where cities like Kharkiv lie, only about 40 kilometers away from the Russian border.
So the problem actually has been in that Kharkiv area where there is intense fighting going on. And in those areas, it is very, very challenging circumstance where Indian officials have not been there. So obviously, the Indian embassy has been communicating with them through the advisories or through the WhatsApp groups or the helplines that they've set up. Obviously, if there are 4,000 Indian nationals, a team of say 5 or 10 officials, it's difficult for them to manage that particular rescue of evacuation of those. So that's why the Indian government has now reached out to both the Ukrainian and the Russian government authorities to facilitate the evacuation of these 4,000 Indian nationals through the Russian territory, which is in the eastern border. So there's a border town in Russia, which is just across the border from Ukraine. They have set up a team and they are talking to the Russians and the Ukrainians to get these 4,000 Indian students from the conflict zone and get them out so that they can safely come back to India.
This is the part that is going to be challenging for India, not just logistically, but also diplomatically, because India has historical ties with Russia and has not condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is something Ukraine has wanted India to do. So, considering this, how hard will it be to seek help from both countries? Shubhajit says that this is where diplomacy will come into play, a tool which is the most important thing in such situations.
So the officials essentially will have to convince and tell their Russian and Ukrainian interlocutors that, this is a humanitarian situation where Indian nationals who don't have anything but there's just by accident that they're caught in the middle of a conflict, they should be given safe passage. So Indian government asked Russian and Ukrainian ambassadors conveyed for a safe passage, and the Russian ambassador designate to India, Denis Alipov, who arrived just a few days ago. He, in a press conference, his first press conference on Wednesday, told reporters in New Delhi that the Russian government is considering safe passage, a humanitarian corridor is what he called, for safe and secure passage of Indian nationals out of the conflict zone.
We have received the Indian request for the emergency evacuation of all those stuck there to the Russian territory. And we are now actively working on the ways and means to launch such an operation and to provide humanitarian corridors so that people have the secure passage to safety on the Russian territory. Yes, we do that.
So I'm sure as we speak, they must be working out the details because obviously there's a fighting going on and where shelling and firing is taking place continuously. So we have to see in the next few days how that evacuation process from the eastern border through the humanitarian corridor, how that plays out.
Now, besides this, the other concern that Indians in Ukraine have right now is that of emergency supplies. Many over there don't have any food or water left and are having to sleep outside without blankets in freezing cold. Shubhajit says that the Indian government is aware of that and has already sent a couple of plane load worth of supplies to the neighboring countries, from where they can reach Ukraine.
Which includes basic amenities, including essential medicines. So I guess that is what is being done in Ukraine. Now, outside Ukraine, which is in the bordering countries, right now we are talking about the 4 neighboring countries to the west of Ukraine, which is Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Slovak Republic. Indian teams have been sent at the border with blankets and, with set of shelters just to kind of give these students or Indian nationals who cross over the border, and so that they can be given some comfort before they board the flight back to their home and to their families and loved ones. So that process is on. For that, about 4 ministers have been dispatched to these countries to oversee this evacuation operation. But within Ukraine, it is a tough situation for Indians who are still stuck in the conflict zone.
Now, as mentioned earlier, Russian forces are slowly moving closer to the Ukrainian capital. And as they do this, India is looking to shut down its embassy there, which will likely make the evacuation process even harder.
On Tuesday, the Foreign Secretary Harshvardhan Shringla said that all Indian nationals have left Kyiv because of the fighting going on. Indian embassy had already issued an advisory to leave the Ukrainian capital. So now the Indian embassy officials, many of them, they have been sent to Lviv, where there is a camp office that was set up, which is near the Ukraine-Poland border. So what happens is now, because of the security situation in Kyiv, the Indian government will take a call on whether it is safe to keep the remaining diplomats in Kyiv or pull them out and relocate them to Lviv, where there is relatively peace and calm, and you need more hands at work there because there's so much of Indian students or Indian nationals who need to be evacuated. So that is a challenge that will be posed once you don't have hands on the ground or eyes and ears on the ground. Then you're completely relying on the Ukrainian forces or the Ukrainian authorities to do the job on the ground. So that's why India doesn't have any resources on the ground in the eastern border. It has sent a team on the Russian side in a border town near Kharkiv, where they can help once people are able to come out of Ukraine to Russia, and then they can be sent back to India. So I guess that is the way the Indian government is trying to manage the situation, which is extraordinarily difficult for a handful of diplomats.
And next we talk about climate change. On Monday, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, released its latest report. IPCC is a global body of scientists that periodically review climate science. And in this report, it has warned that multiple climate change-induced disasters will take place in the next 2 decades, even if strong action is taken to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. The report has inputs from scientists in 67 countries that have made grim predictions about the future ahead. In this segment, we talk about the report with Amitabh Sinha, who writes on science for the Indian Express. So, Amitabh, many say that this latest IPCC report includes some of the gravest warnings that the body has ever given. In what sense do we see that to be the case?
It won't be very surprising if this report is being seen as giving the gravest warnings ever, mainly because climate change is an ongoing phenomenon. The impacts of climate change is worsening by the day as we speak. So it's not very surprising that every subsequent report that comes out that makes an assessment of the impacts of climate change comes out with a more serious warning than the previous one. So in that sense, of course, this particular report would have much more serious, grave warnings than the previous reports.
And the report, of course, also warns us about specific climate change disasters, which it says are going to be inevitable even if strong action is taken. What kind of disasters does it talk about?
The kind of disasters that climate change would manifest in are very well documented. You will have, in terms of extreme weather events that we are already seeing, extreme rainfall, extreme drought, forest fires, wildfires, sea level rise. Those, some of the impacts, the range of climate change impacts are fairly well documented. And these are the kind of things that are being warned of in this report as well. This one is the 6th in the series. The first one came out in 1990. every subsequent report has been building on the evidence that was generated in the previous report. And more evidence is gathered, more and more evidence is presented. So basically what the scientists are doing in every subsequent report is they are able to say the same kind of things, but with much greater clarity, with much greater certainty, because they are armed with better data, they are armed with much more data and scientific evidence to say what they have been saying for a long time.
Okay, so one thing is that with each report, the evidence is a lot more. And plus, what the report predicts, is also predictably getting worse each time. But tell us, does the report say anything about the Indian geographical region?
So a couple of things that are new in this report that were not there in previous reports is a regional assessment. So previous reports usually had only a global assessment. They used to talk about, say, what would be the average sea level rise across the globe. In this particular report, they are able to say what would be the sea level rise, say, in the Indian Ocean or near the Indian coastline. So that's a new thing that they have added in these reports. So there is a regional assessment. At the same time, there is also a lot of city-specific information, which was not in the previous reports. And just to give you an example, since you asked about India-specific information, so this report talks about Mumbai being at high risk from sea level rise as well as flooding. Ahmedabad being at high risk from severe heat waves. Now, again, if you look at it, these are not revelatory. Anyone who has been following news would realize Mumbai had several very severe flooding events in the last few years. Ahmedabad is notorious for heat strokes. So the information itself is not revelatory, but what they have done is they have put a sort of a risk assessment on these cities. When they say these are high risk zones and they are at very high risk from heat waves or from flooding, they have quantified it. They have also made an assessment of all the literature that is available that gives us an idea of how serious the threat from heat waves Ahmedabad is at, or how serious is the threat of flooding in Mumbai.
Okay, so the report mentions Mumbai and Ahmedabad. Are there any other cities that are mentioned in the report?
So these are not the only two cities that have been mentioned in the report. The report also warns that a lot of Indian cities, Chennai, Lucknow, Patna, Bhubaneswar, lots of these cities are also reaching or going to reach very dangerous levels of what is known as wet bulb temperature. Wet bulb temperature basically refers to a situation wherein you measure not just temperature, but also mix humidity with it. And that's something that all of us have experienced. It becomes increasingly discomfortable for us when heat is mixed with humidity. That's not something uncommon. We all have experienced that. What this report is saying that several Indian cities are approaching a very dangerous levels of wet bulb temperature, which is 30 plus degrees by the end of this century, to the extent that living itself, survivability itself would become a problem in several of these cities, because anything above 30 degrees to 32 degrees centigrade in terms of wet bulb temperature becomes very, very difficult for human beings.
And Amitabh, the report for the first time also looks at the health impacts of climate change. What does the report say regarding that?
So it talks about a lot of emerging infectious diseases. It has a whole section on COVID-19 as well. What it says is that climate change is having an impact on the emergence of infectious diseases like COVID-19. Now, it does not, we have to be clear, it does not attribute climate change as one of the reasons for COVID-19. So it says climate change is contributing to the spread of diseases in both wildlife and humans. Increased contact between wildlife and human populations increases disease risk, and climate change is altering where the pathogens that cause diseases and the animals that carry them live. Disease risk can often be reduced by improving healthcare and sanitation systems, training the medical community to recognize and treat potential new diseases in their region, limiting human encroachment into natural areas, limiting wildlife trade, and promoting sustainable and equitable socio-economic development. So they are saying that where these microbes, the viruses and bacteria, where they will emerge, climate change will be not a deciding factor, but certainly a contributing factor in deciding where these will emerge. That's number one. Also, the carriers of these viruses and bacteria, the animals, or even the air, for example. So the atmosphere, whether it is conducive for the spread of a disease or not, there as well, climate change is a contributing factor. So that's all that the report says, but it has a very large section on COVID-19, and it's mainly talking about how the COVID-19 pandemic itself was affecting climate change responses. The fact that because of the pandemic and because the resources were diverted to fight the pandemic, there was a consequential lack of resources. Some resources had to be diverted from climate change to the pandemic. So in that sense, it has affected the response to climate change as well.
In fact, this reminds me that during the first wave of the pandemic, some climate activists were saying that now they understand what a real emergency response looks like. When governments globally take strict and immediate measures. And they said that we have never treated climate change like that, with that sense of emergency.
You're right. So this report does point out that because some of the resources had to be diverted for fighting the pandemic, there was a consequent, some shortage of resources on the climate change front. So in that way, the pandemic has been affecting climate change response. On the health front, it also talks like I was talking about the difference in the shifting patterns. So it does talk about, say, because the rainfall patterns are changing and some places would become much more wetter than earlier. So the diseases that thrive in wet conditions, those areas would become conducive to those kind of diseases. So malaria or dengue can happen at places which have no prior experience of dengue or malaria because the shifting in climate patterns. So those kind of impacts of climate change have been mentioned in this report.
And is there anything else that stands out for you in this report?
No, so as you pointed out, that this probably is the most serious warning that has been sent out, and it acknowledges very prominently the fact that even as we speak, the dangers from climate change actually approaching at a much faster rate. They are likely to create much bigger disasters, and the frequency of those disasters are likely to be much higher than we had previously imagined. And this has been a constant thing in all the IPCC reports. So we are talking about the second part of the sixth assessment report. The first part had come out last year in August. And that one also had said that the 1.5 degree target, 1.5 degree global warming from pre-industrial times is likely to be achieved much earlier than we had earlier imagined. So every progressive report is actually warning us that the climate change is not just real, but is probably much more immediate, is a much bigger danger than we had thought, and probably is going to result into bigger and bigger disasters.
And in the end, we talk about Ashneer Grover. Yesterday, the fintech platform BharatPe removed co-founder and managing director Ashneer Grover from all positions in the company. BharatPe has alleged that Grover's family and relatives engaged in extensive misappropriation of company's funds, including but not limited to creating fake vendors through which they siphoned money away from the company's expense account and grossly abused companies' expense accounts in order to enrich themselves and fund their lavish lifestyles. In response to a query over the company's allegations, Grover told the Indian Express that, quote, "I am appalled at the personal nature of the company's statement but not surprised. It comes from a position of personal hatred and low thinking," unquote. Talking about the allegations of funding a lavish lifestyle through misappropriated company funds, Grover said that the only thing lavish about him were his dreams and ability to achieve them against all odds through hard work and enterprise. On Tuesday, Grover had written to BharatPe's board of directors, resigning from his position as managing director and a board member of the company. In his mail, Grover had alleged that the BharatPe board had ousted him for his vested interests and added that the recent developments related to the company seemed to be a, quote, battle of egos being played out to the gallery of the media under the charade of good governance, unquote. You were listening to Three Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargava, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.